Alara's hand hovered over the final ignition sequence, her nerves screaming as the forbidden transporter hummed with a violent, illicit energy. The world dissolved into a sickening blur of light and static. She materialized on the bridge of the Iron Aegis just as the ship's hull groaned, seconds away from a suicide collision with the Void Swarm. I've spent a lifetime documenting the fall of empires, but some stories demand a witness to the spark before the flame. Subscribe to this chronicle to ensure no sacrifice is ever forgotten. Now, we look back at how a princess of Solis Prime found herself on a dying Terran ship. 6 weeks earlier, the archival drones had been calibrating their sensors for the arrival of a fleet that didn't belong in Aurelian space. Archon Alara stood on the observation spire, her silk robes catching a breeze that smelled faintly of jasmine and filtered oxygen. The Terran fleet didn't descend. It fell. Unlike the Aurelian cruisers, which drifted like glass needles through the atmosphere, the human ships were slab-sided blocks of scarred tungsten and exposed piping. They looked like industrial tools forgotten in a junkyard. Their ships weren't built for beauty. They were built to bleed so others wouldn't have to, Alara's advisor, Kalen, whispered beside her. His lip curled in a way that signaled his disdain for the utilitarian primitives the Emperor had invited to their doorstep. Alara didn't disagree. She watched the lead vessel, the Iron Aegis, touch down with a bone-shaking thud that cracked the white marble of the landing pad. When the ramp hissed open, a man stepped out who looked as weathered as his ship. Commander Elias Thorne didn't bow. He didn't offer a rhythmic greeting or wait for the heralds. He simply wiped grease from his forehead with a rag that might have once been white. The meeting in the war chamber was a collision of two worlds that shared a language but spoke different truths. Alara pointed to the holographic maps, her movements fluid and rehearsed. She spoke of tactical withdrawal and the preservation of the great spires. Protocol won't stop the swarm, Archon, but a little Terran stubbornness might. Thorne interrupted. His voice was like grinding stones. He slammed a heavy, dented metal flask onto the crystalline strategy table, the echo object of his people's endurance. It was a crude thing, scratched and dull, but he gripped it like a talisman. He suggested a forward lean into the Helios Nebula, a place of chaotic radiation where Aurelian sensors would be blinded. He wanted to fight in the mud of the stars. Alara felt a surge of indignation, watching the way his soldiers, rough-edged men and women in bulky hard suits, moved with a frantic, uncoordinated energy that lacked all grace. They were loud. They smelled of ozone and recycled sweat. 3 days into the joint maneuvers, the first engagement proved Alara's fears and Thorne's warnings. The Void Swarm didn't attack with logic. They moved like a liquid shadow, pouring through the gaps in the Aurelian formation. I've seen how the stories we tell ourselves can blind us to the truth standing right in front of our eyes. Subscribe to follow this journey into the heart of the nebula. The Aurelian glass was about to shatter. The Helios Nebula swallowed the light of the twin suns, turning the view screens into a kaleidoscope of static and violet gas. Alara's cruiser, the Resplendent, shuddered as a kinetic beam grazed its shields. Her crew worked with silent, terrified precision, but their movements were stiff, paralyzed by the realization that their elegance was no armor. Through the chaos of the comms, Alara watched the Iron Aegis. It didn't dance. It took hits that would have vaporized an Aurelian scout, its thick plating glowing cherry red. Then the sensors shrieked. A Void Swarm Ravager had locked onto the Resplendent's bridge. Alara braced for the end, watching the countdown on her HUD. But the impact never came. Instead, the massive, ugly silhouette of the Iron Aegis lurched into her field of vision. Thorne had intentionally drifted his ship into the path of the killing blow. She watched through the magnification lens as the human ship's starboard side erupted in a fountain of debris and fire. It was a clumsy, brutal maneuver. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The bridge of the Resplendent was a tomb of silence as the Iron Aegis drifted, venting atmosphere and pride in equal measure. Alara watched through the flickering tactical overlay as the human ship's engines sputtered, yet it remained anchored between the Aurelians and the dark. Thorne's ship wasn't a work of art. It was a scar on the canvas of the nebula. Alara felt the weight of her previous judgments. her obsession with the perfect line of a hull or the proper sequence of a greeting, dissolving like ash. She saw the Terran soldiers, Kessler and Vance, on the external hull monitors. They weren't retreating to the escape pods. Instead, they were tethered to one another, dragging a wounded comrade back into the pressurized airlocks while the hull plates buckled under the heat. They don't get back up because we aren't afraid. We get back up because we're too stubborn to stay down. Thorne's voice crackled over the emergency frequency. It wasn't a boast. It was a weary statement of fact. The tide of the Void Swarm had been momentarily broken, but as the combined fleet limped towards Solis Prime, a shadow larger than any moon eclipsed the stars. The dreadnought had arrived. It was a monolithic entity of teeth and void matter, positioned directly above the capital's atmospheric shield. Aurelian railguns hummed, their elegant capacitors charging for a volley that everyone knew would be insufficient. The dreadnought's reactor was shielded by layers of shifting dimensional energy, impenetrable to standard ordnance. "I'm taking the Aegis in." Thorne's voice was calm now, stripped of its earlier grit. "We've got enough mass and a failing reactor. If I time the overload right, I can punch a hole through that core." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic protest. She looked at her advisor, who was already calculating the necessary sacrifice with cold, Aurelian logic. But Alara saw the dented metal flask on her own command console. Thorne had left it behind during their heated debate. She gripped the cold, scratched steel. It wasn't elegant. It was real. She knew the Terran commander intended to die alone to save a world that had mocked him. She moved before her mind could talk her out of it. She ran toward the restricted research wing, her silk robes tearing against the sharp edges of the corridors. The forbidden transporter was a relic of an era Solis Prime tried to forget, a device that ignored safety protocols for raw power. And then she was there. The transition felt like being turned inside out. Alara slammed onto the deck of the Iron Aegis, the smell of burnt wiring and copper filling her lungs. The bridge was a wreck of sparking consoles and red emergency lighting. Thorne turned, his eyes widening behind a cracked visor as the Archon of Solis Prime stood among the debris. "You're late for the party, Archon," Thorne rasped, his hands locked onto the manual flight sticks. Alara didn't answer with words. She stepped into the co-pilot's seat, her fingers flying across the foreign, chunky Terran interfaces. She bypassed the safety limiters, feeding Aurelian frequency harmonics into the ship's engines. "We do this together," she said, her voice steady for the first time in her life. The Iron Aegis screamed as it accelerated, a jagged spear of Terran steel and Aurelian light. They hit the dreadnought's reactor at the exact moment of the overload. In the microsecond before impact, Alara triggered the transporter's return sequence, the world whitewashing into nothingness. The explosion was a second sun over Solis Prime. When the light cleared, the dreadnought was a cloud of dissipating vapor, and the Void Swarm was retreating into the deep black, their collective mind shattered. Days later, the reconstruction began. There were no victory parades, only the heavy work of clearing marble and steel. Alara stood on the balcony of the ruined palace, no longer wearing the heavy crowns or the layered silks of her office. She was just Alara. Beside her, Elias Thorne leaned against the railing, his arm in a sling. He took a slow drink from that same dented metal flask before handing it to her. The water inside was metallic and lukewarm, but as she took a sip, she realized she had spent a lifetime seeking perfection, only to find truth in the dirt and blood of a primitive's courage. Below them, Aurelian architects and Terran engineers worked side by side, lifting a massive beam into place. The city would be rebuilt, but the lines would be different this time. They would be stronger. Alara looked at the flask, the sunlight catching the deep scratches in the metal where it had survived the fire. It wasn't a relic of the past anymore. It was the foundation of the future. The bridge between us wasn't built with treaties, but with the weight of the flask we shared. If you believe some bonds are forged only in the heat of the forge, subscribe and tell me. What's the one thing you'd sacrifice everything to protect? Our next chronicle begins tomorrow.